the question that has probably driven my work the longest was starting off actually as a research assistant in 1968 on the 1968 Civil Rights Survey. And since that time, in one form or another, I've actually been working on questions of school racial composition, access to quality education, especially as it impacts students of color. And most of my work is focused on looking at how African American students have been able to benefit from or have been impacted by issues of segregation and school desegregation. That work I started doing independently, doing on my own as a research fellow at Johns Hopkins University. Actually, before then, I started over at Duke University, growing out of my dissertation research. So I worked at the Center for Education Policy at Duke, and we worked on the National Panel on School Desegregation in 1970, starting in 1978, 79. And that was exciting work, and it really launched a whole lot of questions for me having to do with understanding the complexities of racial composition of schools and what it meant to be pursuing school desegregation. And out of that work, I became actively involved in several litigations, from Boston Westman case to St. Louis Liddell case, Kansas City, Charlotte Mecklenburg, Prince George's County. So there were several cases there that I was an expert witness in. And my role was always to analyze the school district data. I would get access to all of the district's data and would have an opportunity to explore the question of whether or not race was the central feature of what made the difference in students' educational outcomes. And much of the opposition to this has been to rule out the possibility that race was at the center of determining how students experience their education. What I was able to do in almost all of the cases was to find reliable, strong evidence that race was, and perhaps for me, one of the more satisfying instances of those analyses, that litigation, was actually having the court declare in the Kansas City case that I had been able to demonstrate in a quantitative way, with the school district's data, evidence of vestiges of past discrimination, because the analyses were structured in such a way that I was able to tie current conditions impacting students' educational outcomes to conditions that preceded that date by some 20 years. So it made a fairly direct connection between the time over the time period, which is rare. And so that was quite satisfying to read in the final decision of Judge Clark that this was a clear demonstration of vestiges. That work also led me to participate in post-secondary cases, the Podbereski case, and then subsequently the University of Michigan case. In the Podbereski case, I was pleased to find that the governor had used much of my report to talk about the way in which the efforts to the programmatic pieces, the Podbereski, the scholarship program that the University of Maryland had put in place in order to overcome its history of segregation, was actually showing beneficial effects of desegregating the university, but more than that, also having an impact on desegregating the various fields within the university. So we were able to show through the University of Maryland data that there were actually students who were desegregating fields like math, like physics, like chemistry, many of the STEM fields. So those have been some of the ways in which my early research and early questions turned into an opportunity to really have a chance of making a real difference in the educational outcomes for students. And more recently, I just served as a court-appointed monitor, which is pretty scary stuff to do that at home. So for the Champaign consent decree, I actually was invited to serve the role as the moderator for the PIC committee. And so there's been this long trajectory which has given me an opportunity to try to find ways of translating my work and actually, to some extent, my own personal experiences into ways in which we could further the access to quality educational experiences for students of color, not just black students, but black and Latino students. So that's been extremely gratifying.